It was a routine ferry crossing on one of Europe's busiest routes. A modern vessel with an experienced crew following trusted procedure. However, the ship had a weakness the company had known about for years, yet had chosen to ignore. But when a crew member fell asleep at the wrong time, a calamity of mistakes meant that weakness would come back to haunt. Long before the Channel Tunnel and high-speed trains connecting Britain and France, roll-on, roll-off ferries played a major role in passenger travel across the English Channel, carrying people, trucks, private cars and leisure vehicles between Britain and mainland Europe. In the late 1970s, ship operator Townsend Forson ordered the commissioning of 3 almost identical roll-on, roll-off ferries to compete on the lucrative cross-channel route between Dover in England and the French port of Calais. To be known as the Spirit class, these were Spirit of Free Enterprise, Pride of Free Enterprise, and the subject of today, the Herald of Free Enterprise. They would carry hundreds of passengers alongside cars, trucks and buses, all driven directly on and off the vessel to reduce time in port. They were designed around speed and efficiency, but, as it would turn out, that speed and efficiency came at a price. As was common with roll-on, roll-off ferries at the time, the Spirit-class vessels were built with large, open vehicle decks and without watertight compartments. This meant that, if water ever did somehow enter the ship, there were no watertight barriers to stop it from spreading, and flooding could theoretically overwhelm the ship. To accommodate fast loading and unloading, the Spirit class were fitted with large clamshell-style doors at both ends, allowing vehicles to drive onto the vessel, hence the name roll-on, roll-off. Positioned low near the waterline, from the bridge, the captain couldn't see the doors, and there were no indicator lights to tell him if they were closed or open. It was Townsend Forson's procedure that, when in port, the assistant boatswain was responsible for closing the bow doors before departing. The first officer should remain in position to confirm the doors were closed, then go to the bridge to inform the captain. In practice, however, verbal confirmation was rarely given. Captains assumed the doors were closed once the first officer arrived on the bridge. As a result, the ship's safety depended on assumptions with almost no actual confirmation. Not surprisingly, the system had already failed more than once. In October 1983, Pride of Free Enterprise sailed from England to Belgium with the bow doors open after the assistant boatswain fell asleep in port and the first officer left the vehicle deck without noticing. The incident helped create a dangerous impression that sailing with the doors open was, although not ideal, not a serious threat to the ship's safety. When a similar incident occurred again that year, it reinforced management's view that the procedure, while imperfect, didn't require urgent change. In the aftermath of those incidents, some of the captains raised concerns with Townsend Forson and requested that indicator lights be installed on the bridge to show whether the vehicle deck doors were closed. However, those requests were, to say the least, firmly rejected. An internal memo revealed a dismissive attitude towards safety improvements. One manager's comments questioned whether an indicator light was really needed to let the captain know whether the vehicle deck storekeeper was awake and sober. Another manager responded to the requests of an indicator light to tell the captain if the doors were shut by saying, "Don't we already pay someone for that?" and "Assume the guy who shuts the door tells the bridge if there is a problem." These assumptions ignored the fact that the system had already failed on multiple occasions. On the 6th of March 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise would be sailing from Dover, England, to the Belgian port of Zeebrugge instead of her usual Dover to Calais. After an uneventful crossing, the ship docked in Zeebrugge unloaded vehicles and passengers, and began preparations for the return journey that evening. However, the harbour at Zeebrugge wasn't designed for Spirit-class ferries. As a result, the ramp there couldn't get high enough to reach the ship's upper vehicle deck. To compensate, the ship's ballast tanks were filled with water to lower the vessel to the height of the ramp. Running slightly behind schedule that evening, however, meant the tanks were left full after loading, saving time but leaving the ship closer to the waterline than usual. While in port, crew members not immediately required would take a short break. Assistant boatswain Mark Stanley, who had, according to some reports, been working for 18 hours, would get a short break in his cabin. He'd be needed back on deck to close the bow doors before departure. After loading was complete, the captain called for all hands on deck. This meant that all crew should report to their stations in preparation for departure back to England. However, Assistant Boatswain Mark Stanley, whose job it was to close the bow doors, had slept through his break and had slept through the all hands on deck call too. First Officer Leslie Sable was required to remain on the vehicle deck to ensure that Stanley had closed the doors. After that, report to his station on the bridge. However, he left the vehicle deck, believing Stanley would arrive shortly to close the doors. Interestingly, he wasn't the last crew member on the vehicle deck that night. That would be Chief Boatswain Terence Ayling. When asked why he hadn't closed the doors, given there was no one else there to do it, he said, "It has never been part of my duties to close the doors or make sure anybody is there to close them." At around 8:05 p.m, with 459 passengers, 80 crew, and a full load of vehicles, Captain David Lurie took the Herald of Free Enterprise out of Zeebrugge Harbour for the return journey to Dover. However, due to the ballast tanks still being full, the ship sat closer to the waterline than usual. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be an issue. Tonight, it would be deadly. As the speed increased, seawater began rushing through the open bow doors and onto the vehicle deck. In mere seconds, the free movement of water engulfed the ship. Electrical power failed, the ship went dark, and passengers and crew became trapped inside flooding compartments. In just 90 seconds, the Herald of Free Enterprise had rolled onto her side, coming to rest on a sandbank with her starboard side above the water. It was the crew of a nearby ship dredging the harbour that witnessed the carnage and raised the alarm, and as luck would have it, the Belgian Navy was operating nearby and was quick to respond. They were joined by rescue helicopters, Royal Navy divers, and nearby civilian vessels, including a ferry whose captain helped pull survivors from the water and off the exposed side of the ship. With water temperatures around 3 degrees Celsius or 37 degrees Fahrenheit, for those still trapped inside the hull and other parts of the ship, hypothermia was as big a threat as drowning. Divers worked through the night, pulling survivors from air pockets and the accessible parts of the ship. However, as the tide rose, rescue efforts had to be halted, and sadly, by the time the rescue resumed, most of those still on board had died from the cold. When all was said and done, one tiny mistake had cost the lives of 193 people. The investigation into the tragedy was conducted through a formal public inquiry in London under Justice Barry Sheen. The findings identified a major chain of failures. Mark Stanley, assistant boatswain, failed to report to duty and close the bow doors. Leslie Sable, the first officer, failed in his duty to ensure the bow doors were closed before heading to the bridge, and Captain David Lurie departed without confirmation that the doors were closed, relying on a system that provided no direct verification. Beyond individual actions, The inquiry criticised Townsend Forson's management, pointing to poor communication, ignored warnings, and a dismissive attitude towards safety requests. The rejection of door indicator lights, despite repeated near misses, was highlighted as a critical cause. Charges were brought against several individuals and Townsend Forson, including gross negligence and manslaughter. However, the court found that responsibility was so widely shared that no single person could be held legally accountable, and the defendants were acquitted. By late April 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise was refloated and the remaining bodies were recovered. She was towed to the Netherlands, sold for scrapping, renamed Flushing Range, and began her final voyage, being towed to Taiwan in October of 1987. The disaster had destroyed more than just a ship. Townsend Forson's name became synonymous with failure, and the company rebranded to P&O European Ferries. In the years that followed, ferry design and regulations changed, bridge indicators became standard, and assumptions were replaced with confirmation. Herald of Free Enterprise capsized because one man left a door open, and several others failed to notice. Can one man really be blamed when a single moment of human error brought down an entire system? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To learn about the mystery of the Amtrak 188 crash, you can click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.